Hi everyone, my name is Hayley Boxall. I am a research manager here at the Australian Institute of Criminology, and I head up the Violence Against Women and Children research program. So today I wanted to take you through some key findings from a recent study that we've undertaken here at the ARC, which looked at the prevalence and nature of domestic violence experiences amongst women in the Australian community during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it seems like a bit of an understatement to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has had major implications for the day-to-day lives of Australians. So this includes the transition to work from home arrangements, increased unemployment, closure of businesses, closure of schools, as well as social isolation and social distancing measures. Amidst all of this, there has been consistent concerns raised by domestic violence practitioners and advocates that the necessary measures we have put in place to limit the spread of COVID-19 may have major impacts on women who experience domestic violence within the Australian community, as well as their ability to reach out for support and advice. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at the prevalence and experiences of domestic violence within the Australian community, largely looking at police data, so police reporting trends over the last few months. And there have also been a few studies that have involved surveying domestic violence practitioners about their experiences or trends amongst the clientele that they engage with. So while this information is hugely valuable, it does only present one aspect of a much larger problem. The vast majority of women will not engage with the police or domestic violence services at any stage during their relationship, but particularly while they are still partnered with their abusers. So what we wanted to do at the ARC was to undertake a study that looked at the prevalence and nature of domestic violence experienced by Australian women during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we did is we developed an online survey which was administered to 15,000 women who identified as female and were 18 years and over. Women were recruited through online research panels which are managed by iLink Research Services, and these are comprised of individuals who have consented to receive invitations to participate in a range of different online surveys, and once they complete these surveys they get small gifts or rewards. So the survey was administered for 3 weeks in the month of May 2020, and women were asked about their experiences over the last 3 months. So the survey period that we're really looking at runs roughly between February 2020 and May 2020. So women were asked a series of questions about their experiences of violence and abuse, help seeking, financial stress, and social isolation. So when we were developing the survey, the safety of women who were responding was at the forefront of our minds. So we developed a series of rigorous safety protocols. So in the first instance, women were recruited by iLink Research Services, not by the AIC. And these were women who were used to receiving multiple invitations to participate in different types of research. So it was unlikely that an invitation to participate in this study was going to raise the attention or concerns of an abuser that they were cohabiting with. Further, the survey was designed to be very short to minimise the amount of time that women had to actually complete the survey. And also there was nothing in the invitation materials to indicate that this was a survey targeted at domestic violence and abuse, or even that it was for women only. This information only came to light when respondents answered a series of eligibility criteria questions to identify that they actually met the criteria for the study. Having said this, we also included a series of safety trap questions to identify if men were just posing as women to try and get into the survey. Finally, we also designed the survey so that women did not have to provide free text information. So free text information being when you type into a keyboard something about yourself. Instead, women just had to point and click on different little items. So these are closed response questions. And using this meant that male abusers were less likely to be able to use things like keylogger technologies to identify what their partners were doing online. So the definition of domestic violence that we used for the purpose of this study included both physical and non-physical forms of violence and abuse that occurred between current and former cohabiting partners. So cohabiting partners are people that the respondents said that they had lived with for at least part of the time over the last 12 months. It also includes attempted behaviours and face-to-face threats. So the forms of violence and abuse we included are physical violence, sexual violence, emotionally abusive, harassing or controlling behaviours, which is a bit of a mouthful, but includes things like constantly belittling their partner and limiting their access to key amenities, so things like the car, the phone, internet, things like that, and coercive controlling behaviours. So coercive controlling behaviours involves the micro-regulation of women's lives and involves a pattern of behaviour over a period of time, which involves things like interfering with their friendships with their friendships and family members, stalking them, harassing them online, and things of that kind of nature. So we define coercive control for the purpose of this study as the presence of 3 or more emotionally abusive, harassing or controlling behaviours over the last 3 months. So something to say about our sample, we did have 15,000 respondents, which is a large sample, but it is also a nationally representative sample. So in the first instance, iLink recruited on the basis of a quota. So they were trying to represent the spread of women across the Australian community, but we also did weighting once we had the sample based on age and jurisdiction. So the data I'm going to present here is weighted data. So I could say a lot more about the sampling and how we did the survey because I think it's really interesting. But for those of you who are interested, we did develop a technical appendices which includes a huge amount of information about how we did this and also around the weighting of the data. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then I would encourage you to go to the AIC website. Okay, so what did we find? In the first instance, looking at prevalence. So what we found is that amongst women who are 18 years and over, there were high levels of reported physical and non-physical domestic violence. So 4.2% of women said they had experienced physical violence, which ranged from things like pushing and shoving and holding someone through to strangling someone or shooting them with a gun. 2.2% of women experienced sexual violence. 11.6% of women experienced at least one form of emotionally abusive, harassing or controlling behaviours, and 5.8% of women experienced coercive control. So these numbers, as you would expect, increased when we limited the sample to women who said that they had been in a cohabiting relationship over the last 12 months. So this was about half of our sample. So what we see here is that the proportion of women, who experienced physical violence increased to 8.2%, sexual violence to 4.2%, and emotionally abusive, harassing, controlling behaviours occurred in about 1 in 4 relationships, and coercive control was present in about 1 in 10. So what we're really seeing here is that there are high levels of reported violence experienced by women during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. We provide a huge amount of detail about the nature of those experiences, so the different types of violence and abuse reported by women. However, I just wanted to highlight a few here, particularly because of the significant harms associated with these types of violence, but also their links with ongoing patterns of serious offending behaviours, including intimate partner homicide. So 1.9% of women were strangled, choked or grabbed around the neck over the last 3 months. 1.6% of women were hit with a weapon, beaten, stabbed or shot at with a gun. 2.6% of women were stalked online or in person. 2.7% of women said their partner had threatened to hurt themselves. And 3.3% of women said their partner had accused them of having an affair. So beyond looking at just individual forms of domestic violence, what we see is that there is a co-occurrence of physical and non-physical forms of violence experienced by women. So for the purpose of this, I'll talk about complex forms of violence. So amongst women who said that they had experienced physical or sexual violence or coercive control over the last 3 months, over half of them said that they had experienced both. So these were women who were experiencing physical or sexual violence and controlling behaviours, so the micro-regulation of their lives. Much rarer were coercive controlling behaviours in isolation, so without the presence of any physical or sexual violence, and even rarer still was the presence of physical or sexual violence in the absence of coercive controlling behaviours. So not only are experiences of domestic violence quite common amongst women during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, but many women are experiencing complex forms of domestic violence as well. So as part of the survey, when someone identified that they had experienced any form of domestic violence over the last 3 months, we also asked them whether or not they had experienced prior violence within their relationship, so prior to February 2020. And what we see here is that About a third of women who experienced physical or sexual violence said that they had not experienced domestic violence within the relationship prior to this point. And about 1 in 5 women who experienced coercive control said the same. So this was the first time they had experienced emotionally abusive, harassing, or controlling behaviours within their relationship. What this really highlights is that for many women, the COVID-19 pandemic has coincided with the onset of domestic violence within their relationships, and that's really concerning. However, for the majority of women, we see that the COVID-19 pandemic has really they've experienced an ongoing pattern of behaviour that just continued during the COVID-19 pandemic. So amongst these women who said they had experienced prior violence, we asked them whether or not the violence had been increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. And what we see from this figure is that for many of these women, the COVID-19 pandemic has coincided with an increase in the severity and frequency of the violence that they're experiencing. So what we see here is 53.1% of women who said they had experienced physical or sexual violence said that the violence was worse, had increased over the last 3 months relative to the 6-month period prior to February 2020. And 47% of women who experienced coercive control said the same thing. So again, this is really concerning. Shifting our attention towards help-seeking behaviours. So anyone who said that they had experienced domestic violence, we asked them whether or not they had engaged with any kind of support service or friends and family and things like that for advice and support, I guess, during this period of time as well, so over the last 3 months. So what we see is that for women who are experiencing physical or sexual violence and coercive control, so those women who are experiencing complex forms of domestic violence, many of them were reaching out for supports, which is really positive. So during the last 3 months, 54% said that they had contacted the police, 52.5% said that they had engaged with a government or a non-government service. So this could be a domestic violence service, a mental health service, housing, welfare, things of that nature. And 2/3 had engaged with informal sources of support. So these are friends, family, spiritual advisors, things of that kind of nature. Then we see that reporting decreases substantially when we're looking at women who experience physical or sexual violence in the absence of coercive control. So here we see that 5.8% of women said they called the police, 7.8% engaged with a government or non-government service, and about 1 in 4 engaged with an informal source of support. Increasing slightly, but still much lower than women who experience complex forms of violence. Women who said they experienced coercive control but not physical or sexual violence over the last 3 months. 1 in 10 said they called the police, 14.1% said they contacted a government service, and 43.2% engaged with informal services. So the fact that women who are experiencing complex forms of violence were also the proportion of these women reported engaging with other services is likely attributable to the nature of the violence that they are experiencing. So we have to think about the cumulative impact of microregulation of their lives, but also physical and sexual violence on their day-to-day functioning. However, when we actually kind of looked at the types of violence that this group of women were experiencing, we see some really interesting trends. So for example, over half of the women experiencing complex forms of violence said that their partner had tried to strangle them over the last 3 months, relative to 1 in 10 women who said that they had experienced physical or sexual violence in the absence of coercive controlling behaviours. Further, women who said that they were experiencing complex forms of violence, about 1 in 3 said that they had experienced 10 or more different types of controlling behaviours over the last 3 months, relative to about 1 in 20 women who said they're experiencing coercive control in isolation. So what you see for these women is a complex interplay of very serious coercive controlling behaviours that are being supported by physical and sexual violence. So it's a really concerning kind of experiences that we're seeing for this group of women. So it is encouraging that they actually are reaching out for supports. However, on the flip side of this, when we asked women whether or not there had been at least one occasion over the last 3 months where they had not been able to access support and advice because of safety concerns that they had, we see that women experiencing complex forms of violence were much more likely to report that they had safety concerns related to help seeking relative to the other groups. So 58.1% of women experiencing complex forms of violence said that there had been at least one occasion where they hadn't sought help because they were worried about their safety. This reduced down to 9% of women who are experiencing physical violence or sexual violence but not coercive control, and 16.7% of women who are experiencing coercive control only in the absence of physical or sexual violence. So while this group were more likely to engage with support, so were also more likely to experience help-seeking barriers, which is of course of concern. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, what we really see is that that the rates of domestic violence being reported is quite high, and it is of major concern, particularly as this is a very short period of time that we're talking about over the last 3 months. We're also seeing that many women are experiencing complex forms of violence, and that these women who are experiencing complex forms of violence, while they are able to eventually reach out for help and support, many of them are experiencing barriers to doing that. So overall, I guess the biggest key finding for us is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, 2 in 3 women reported the onset or escalation of physical or sexual violence. So for many women, this was the first time that they experienced violence, but for another bigger cohort of women, they had experienced the escalation in the frequency or severity of the violence. And we see something very similar for women who experience coercive control. So 1 in 2 women who said that they experienced coercive control over the last 3 months said that this was either the first time they had experienced this form of violence or that the violence had gotten worse over the last 3 months. So what we really do see here is a very concerning trends during the initial stage of the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you very much for listening in. Hopefully this will be the first of a number of different papers that we present on key findings from this study, including looking at the mechanisms associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and its relative impact on domestic violence, as well as the experiences of domestic violence amongst vulnerable groups within the community. So thank you very much.